right. So thank you again for everyone coming through today. Welcome to the Prince George's African American Museum's virtual program, Our Roots Revolutionary, Afro Native Heritage, and Family Life in Prince George's County. This event will explore the history of Afro Native heritage and family life in Prince George's County with our very special guest, Lonnie Harrington, who I will be sharing more information about in the upcoming minutes. I want to take some time first to thank the Prince George's African American Museum Board of Directors. Also, I want to take some time to thank Marifa Bermudez, our marketing coordinator, Mr. Lonnie Harrington, our esteemed guests, and all of you, our guests, for joining us today. And we truly do hope that you would enjoy and be impacted by today's discussion. We will begin the program with a discussion on some quick facts about Afro-Native heritage in Prince George's County North to set the stage. Now, let me be clear before we discuss that this is not going to cover every single facet of Native or Indigenous history within Prince George's County or the larger Maryland context. We'll give some reference points as we go through the discussion for people who are doing work specifically in these areas. But I do want to, again, just set the stage for why this is important. For anyone who does not know, I want to share a PowerPoint really quickly, if everyone can see, as we go through discussing why this history matters. Can everybody see? Give me a thumbs up. Everyone can see?
Yes.
Stellar, thank you. All right, so again, we're talking about Afro-Native history within Prince George's County. I want to start off, of course, by giving some book resources from the beginning. And we're going to reference these resources later on when Mr. Harrington shares on his extensive experience. But I want to give some book references that I would highly suggest for everyone to take time to investigate. Part of my background is in regards to Afro-Indigenous studies, because my ethnic background is of Afro-Caribbean descent. My ancestors are specifically Coromantine. They were people who were part of the Maroons in Jamaica and also in many parts of Guyana. I also have roots of the Gullah Geechee people in the Carolinas. And that's on my father's side. On my mother's side, that's where we have the Maroon roots specifically. And so Afro-Indigenous history is a very deep part of my heart. The first book I want to recommend is called Africans and Native Americans, The Language of Race and the Evolutions of Red Black Peoples. This book is by the late Dr. Jack D. Forbes, who was one of the leading Indigenous scholars in the world on the intersections of African peoples of the diaspora and Indigenous peoples on Turtle Island, as we say. I hear someone's mic is not off. If you would mute yourself so that we don't have any feedback, that'd be greatly appreciated. Thank you. So check out that book. The next book is Indivisible. It was actually a presentation originally at the Smithsonian's Museum of the American Indian. Indivisible, African Native American Lives in the Americas is highly recommended because it talks about the experiences of people that have often been treated as invisible within the US context, people that have mixed ancestry. If I mention names like Crispus Attucks, who was considered the first casualty of the American Revolution, you know, many would know, well, he's Black, he's African American. But the truth is that he was also Native American because his mother was Wampanoag and his father was of an African tribe. There were others like Paul Kufi as well, who had the same experience. He was one of the leading African American figures in history, who created the first shipping, was considered one of the first shipping companies that opened up doors for African Americans to go back to Africa. But he also had Afro-Indigenous roots. So this book is a good book to check out on that history. The last book, real quickly, is called Black Indians, A Hidden Heritage by the late Dr. William Katz. He was a mentor, a distant mentor of mine, and a friend of Lonnie Harrington as well, and ours, who encouraged us and was a leading scholar to show Indigenous and Black history in the US context. So I will consider his work highly. Going forward, let's talk briefly about some of the things regarding Prince George's history when it comes to the Piscataways. The following quote is by James Mooney in the 1911 Catholic Encyclopedia. He says, those who remain in Maryland are represented today by a few Negro mongrels who claim the name. Now, for those who don't know, of course, that is a highly discriminatory comment, but that comment was made in regards to the history that we're talking about today. There were people who were specifically removed by force at several points throughout Maryland's history. People who lived in the Chesapeake region, the Piscataway people, were among several indigenous tribes that were removed in waves. And one of the ways that they were removed specifically was in regards to reclassification. Many of those who remained behind as remnants, they had to deal with that battle of being considered, remembering where they came from as indigenous peoples, but then being relabeled in many cases as mulatto, as mixed, or as Negro. As an example of some of these attempts at erasure, the following quote is from Bacon's Laws of Maryland, enacted in 1717. Be it therefore enacted by the right honorable, the Lord Proprietary, by and with the advice and consent of his lordship's governor, and the upper and lower houses of assembly, and by the authority of the same, that from and after the end of this present session of assembly, no Negro or mulatto slave, free Negro or mulatto born of a white woman during his time of servitude by law, or any Indian slave or free Indian natives of this or the neighboring provinces be admitted and received as good and valid evidence in law, in any matter or thing whatsoever, depending before any court of record, or before any magistrate within this province, wherein any Christian white person is concerned. Again, that was from Bacon's Laws of Maryland, enacted in 1717. As previously discussed, there were several points historically in Maryland's history where people of Native ancestry were literally relabeled and reclassified by looks alone, unfortunately, as being mixed or mulatto, even though they had strong roots to the land and could document their history. This was part of an attempt to push the Native peoples out and to say that any remaining natives did not have validity, because in order to have validity, you had to be considered one of the people. There was a major, again, recasting of indigenous peoples throughout the Chesapeake region as mulattoes and free people of color at several points within Maryland's history. And this coincided also with the erasure of reservations in the 1700s and the 1800s. Give you a quick, this is the last thing we're going to say before we go into our esteemed guests. In the 1890s, James Mooney did research on behalf of the Bureau of American Ethnology to research Native communities remaining after extensive removal from their traditional lands. Many of the families who identified as members of the Piscataway chieftain tribes were identified by neighbors as being part Negro. Unfortunately, racial reclassification laws developed in the early 1900s led to many having the only option of only being able to identify as either Black or white. If you check out Mooney's papers, which can be found in Suitland, Maryland, specifically, his papers describe a group of people in Prince George's County who had the surname Proctor. And these people were described specifically as having brown complexions and straight Black hair, and they traced their ancestry back to the old Piscataway Empire. On the left side of the screen, one of the historical books that I went through called Prince George's County, A Pictorial History, it shows pictures of how some of the people looked when it came to farming communities in Southern Maryland. They lived apart by themselves in isolated groups or remnants of, or we consider remnants of the previous indigenous people. Many of them felt that these people were simply of Black ancestry and white ancestry, and their family records have appeared in the legal records of Charles and Prince George's County, including in places like Brandywine. However, there was a battle for them to find recognition because of their complexion alone. Based on the phenotype they had, people assumed that to be Black meant that that's all you were. So even if you said, my mother is from this particular tribe, and my father, also comes from these lands, you couldn't be respected because looks are what people went by. And for many of us, when it comes to what's also known as paper genocide and erasure by color, it's a very painful history that impacts many Piscataways to this day. It actually happens across the Americas for many indigenous and African peoples due to their mixture. So with that being said, that brief history, I want to go back to our esteemed guest, Lonnie Harrington, who I'm very, again, excited to introduce. Lonnie Harrington is of Seminole, Choctaw, and Native ancestry, specifically Seminole, Cherokee, Choctaw, and Shawnee ancestry. He's done extensive work with Afro Native organizations across the country. He's also been someone who has been highly involved in regards to the arts administration in New York City with the Department of Cultural Affairs. He's also been a consultant for various arts organizations since 1981. He has also been a tribal dancer and has done, he's been extensively involved in drum circles across this nation for decades. He is also someone who is very passionate for the topic we're talking about today. So Mr. Harrington, with that being said, and discussing Afro-Native history briefly in Prince George's County, I want to ask you some questions. Question number one, what is your cultural heritage specifically, and what was it like for you growing up as an Afro-Native in the United States? Please take the floor.
Well, in terms of my heritage, my mother's side of the family, I'm African and Seminole. My father's side of the family, African, Cherokee, Choctaw, and Shawnee. And I'm originally from a place known as the Kanayuxka. In the words of our Ueyache, the ancient ones, the ancient ancestors, that word means the land blessed by the sun, the moon, and the children of the stars. Other of the Ueyache call it Ichibi, which means deer nose. But to be quite blunt about it, a man on a slaving expedition by the name of Ponce de Leon gets there. It's been called Florida ever since. So for the sake of brevity today, I was born in Florida and spent some of my boyhood there, but I have been living in New York City for a long time. Many of us in the South, especially going back to the 50s, were aware of our multiple roots of our heritage. I wouldn't say we did anything particularly profound at that time, but unfortunately coming north in 1959 and spending many of my growing up years in the North, there was a certain stigma coming from the rural South to the North. So if you start mentioning that you were quote unquote part Indian, that was not looked upon very favorably. And unfortunately, when racism plays into this, as I got older, some of those comments got much more nastier, especially when I got in high school. I was actually ridiculed and mocked on a pretty regular basis anytime I mentioned my heritage. It wasn't until I met a Cheyenne brother in college who accepted me as a brother because I had Native blood that I was more out front about it. I never particularly hid my heritage, although I didn't discuss it. But after meeting Billy Joe Cruz, my Cheyenne brother, and looking into my own heritage, I've been a very proud man and I'm sometimes outspoken when it comes to this ever since.
I appreciate you sharing that. I want to ask you another question in connection with that one we just mentioned. When it comes to someone saying, I identify as Afro-Native, I know that you and I have had multiple conversations because of our similar backgrounds regarding my African-American heritage and my Afro-Caribbean, Afro-Indigenous Caribbean heritage as well. I'm curious what it was like for you when it came to being bullied. What did bullying look like for you specifically when it came to saying I'm Afro-Native and I'm Black?
Well, I got a lot, you trying to pass, you ain't proud of being Black kind of thing. And sometimes I bordered on the verge of violence when I ran into some more insecure sort of individuals about this. I call them cultural police, if you will. But usually it was more verbal attacks. And certainly those could be quite painful. I had some experiences I'm recalling right now, which is very moving. I will say this though, being rooted in your heritage, if you know who you are, you don't have to fall victim and prey to those sort of bullying tactics, be it verbal or otherwise. I don't know if I answered that. Go ahead.
No, I did. I would like you to share with the audience in specific, because again, we're talking about the broader experience of what it's like to be Afro-Native or Native African-American, which is, as you and I both know, and many of us, probably have heard of. It's very easy to dismiss and minimize in the same way that people of mixed ancestry in the African diaspora find it difficult to feel like they have a space because the options for identification have been so limited. That goes to my second question, actually, that I want to ask you specific. What are some of the things that you feel for those who identify as African-American? What do you think are some of the things that you feel African Americans in Prince George's County should know when it comes to the importance of Afro-Native heritage within the Black experience? Again, please share it.
Well, there's a saying in academic circles, cultural intersection. We're not monolithic. And you can look at that either from an African American perspective or a Native American perspective. Definitely research your family's history. Be proud of all of who you are. I will say this, as a boy in Florida, I'm glad my mother used to take me on visits to what was then Dania Seminole Reservation, now known as Hollywood. So she made the contact for me as a young boy. So again, I have that roots. Unfortunately, I never met my father's mother, who was Cherokee and Choctaw, but he often spoke about her. Just on a quick aside, though, I actually found out too, my Shawnee great-grandmother had married a former member of the 10th Cavalry, a Buffalo soldier, if you will, who was a veteran of the Battle of San Juan Hill in Cuba. So again, I would say talk to your family first, and don't dismiss those stories. If you hear one of your elders at a family functioning start talking about this, that, and the other, there's a lot of history and richness there. It's all part of what you are. And again, we're not monolithic.
Right.
Look at the broad picture and then start to put things together. I will say this also, I'm speaking as somebody who came up outside of, let's say, a reservation community. If I had been raised in a reservation community, my perspective might have been a little bit different because of pressures historically put on those communities. You alluded to it somewhat. You talked about this Piscataway before. Certainly in many parts of the 20th century and going back further than that, those of mixed ancestry, especially Black and Native ancestry in those communities, really brought a lot of pressure from the US government onto those communities in a very negative fashion. You talked about what happened in the instance of Piscataway. We can certainly look at Virginia in 1924 with the passage of the Racial Integrity Law. Okay, basically what the Bureau of Vital Statistics said then, that there are only two races in Virginia, white and colored. And when they decided to aim those at the indigenous communities there, many of those communities were forced to kick out their Black members. I have friends of mine that had grandparents and great-grandparents that were victims of that. Right. So these sort of things have gone on. But again, getting back to answer your question directly, look at the bigger picture and don't be afraid to ask questions. Right. But do so in a respectful manner, though.
I think that's so critical what you mentioned, specifically with what happened with the Piscataway people, and of course, several others, the Nanacook and the Powhatan. I don't want to mispronounce it. I'm so sorry.
Well, the list goes on and on and on and on.
Algonquin-speaking chieftains in the Chesapeake region, specifically, they experienced something very similar to what happened with the Dawes Act, where because of racial reclassification, you no longer had to identify people based on their tribal roots. You no longer had to identify people based on their documents. You could simply look at their looks alone and say, you look like this, and therefore you can't really be who you are, because to look Black means you have no ties to the land here.
Well, Gabriel, and I'm going to be quite blunt about it. You and I have discussed this before. My opinion of the Dawes Act, it's an example of ethnic cleansing in overdrive. And please quote me on that. I have no problems with that. And anyone would like to discuss that further with me, I'll tell you how to contact me. But yeah, looking at the history of Oklahoma, that definitely started the chain of events which led to Oklahoma becoming a state, which, by the way, in itself was a treaty violation. But we don't have time to go into that today.
By the way, I did want to mention for the audience, of course, I believe I mentioned it earlier. Some of these dynamics hit home for you because you're actually connected to historical figures who are not only Afro-Natives, but were Afro-Native leaders, such as John Horse, who actually worked in regards to organizing resistances and rebellions between people of African descent who were fleeing from enslavement, and the Seminole Nation, and they joined together to become the Black Seminoles. I believe at one point, didn't they flee from the South into the Midwest and down to other spaces?
We don't have time to go. I don't mean to cut you off. We don't have time to go into it extensively, but let me try to narrow that down somewhat. Yes, John Horse was one of our great resistance leaders. Now, some of us were forced into Indian territory, the areas that you now call Oklahoma. John Horse was one of those folks that was forced to Indian territory. But unfortunately, the social situation in Indian territory got worse and worse for people of African Native descent and other more traditional indigenous folks that didn't want to be part of that nonsense, if you will. So in 1849, Kawaya, or John Horse as we call him, along with Coacochi or Wildcat, led the first of 3 exoduses out of Indian Territory into Northeast Mexico. So yeah, our diaspora, Seminole diaspora, goes wide, wide and far. That's going west. We don't have time to go into it today, but it also goes east into the ocean because there is a Seminole community on North Andros Island at Red Bays. So yeah, our diaspora is quite diverse. But
there's a picture, by the way, I want to show the audience. Can everyone see? Sorry about that. If everyone can see this particular picture that we have right here, I want to talk really briefly in regards to our conversation on Afro-Native history from a broad perspective.
Can I just identify those folks too for the audience, because I happen to know them all.
Of course.
The elder gentleman we lost about 2 years ago is John Griffin. The younger brother is his nephew, Matthew Griffin. They've been very involved with Seminole culture, and specifically Black Seminole culture in Florida. Now, if I remember correctly, the sister in the middle is Professor Rosalind Howard, who actually wrote a book about the Black Seminole community on North Andros Island. Yeah, these are some of my relatives in the broader sense speaking.
There's a book actually I would recommend for everyone, just to give out one quick reference if you're interested. It's by Dr. Rosalind. It's called Black Seminoles in the Bahamas.
Yes.
She deals specifically with the experience of Seminoles, similar to what many other Native groups had, even in the North, actually, where they fled and they ended up fleeing specifically from the southern areas and the northern areas of the United States and came to the Caribbean. So for those who may be wondering, what about the history of indigenous peoples that are here in the Maryland area? You may want to consider that many of them got connected with multiple other tribes across the Eastern Shore in order to find their freedom. On the left side of the screen, by the way, what you see here is a picture of the Underground Railroad, and just a quick freebie for Black History Month. One of the things that many don't talk about is that the Underground Railroad did not just go north. We know about people like Harriet Tubman and the amazing work, the powerful work that she did to free African Americans in enslavement. But the Underground Railroad also went south as well, which ties into the larger narrative of indigenous histories as they intersect with African peoples. Many of the people who fled enslavement joined forces with indigenous tribes on multiple levels, and they fled not only into the Caribbean, but into the Southwest as well. And so there are many people that you will walk by and simply think, oh, they're just Black. And yes, they are Black, but they actually have mixed ancestry within the Black experience. But this history is not well known. And so it's important for us to get these history points out there for people. But that's, again, we only have so much time. And so I want to go ahead and end with this final question that I have for you. Mr. Harrington, why do you feel that there is such a neglect of this cultural heritage of Afro-Native history within the diaspora experience in the US today, within Prince George's County specifically, or included within Prince George's County as well? Why do you feel there's such a neglect of that?
Well, we've been taught to suppress that side of our history. Unfortunately, divide and conquer tactics are quite real, and they go back to shortly after 1492, if you will. But unfortunately, we've been made to be ashamed of that. As you know, I mentioned before that some others that were raised in reservation communities had to deal with these very real outside political pressures, which brought a lot of negativity to those communities if you had African ancestry. Conversely, outside of those communities, many of our elders were taught to suppress this. And I know certainly in my family, there's been a lot of pain associated with that. Let me just say this one on the aside though, over the course of doing research since the early 70s, I want to thank those elders that were able to speak with me and speak with me frankly, because again, I understand the pain they went through.
Right.
But again, I just say, please be proud of all of who you are.
When you say all of who you are, what are some ways that you feel that we can be proud of that? For those who want to actually do more discussion and research. I know you mentioned earlier that studying your roots is a big deal. I'm assuming with things like genealogy, studying your genealogical roots. There are spaces, by the way, for others to check out, such as Afro-Indigenous history. If you look on Facebook, that's one of those discussion group that you can check out. There are several other books that you can check out beyond the ones that we've gotten as well. But I know that studying the ancestors that we come from is a critical point of celebrating all of who we are. What are some other ways that you feel people in Prince George's County could do that if they're interested or have heard some of those stories?
Again, start with your elders. Try to go to various different functions. If you go to functions though, say, powwows, for example, approach in a respectful manner. Again, there's still a lot of pain affiliate even today with this. And some of the, especially the older folks may not want to talk about it. But again, if you come in a respectful manner and be patient and show that respect, you'll be able to start putting different stories together. Hopefully will aid you in your own search. Let me tell you, it's a marathon and not a sprint. You know, you mentioned John Horst before. I only found out I was related to him last year after all this time by finally touching base with another cousin. And we started talking more in detail about our family history. And to say the least, I'm still very moved by that because I grew up, this was one of my heroes. And to find that I'm actually blood related to him has been very moving, to say the least. I mean, we can go on and on and on, but this is just enough to get people started.
And I've also, to your point, what's interesting is that many people have these family stories interconnected because of things like travel. There have been people who came up, for example, from Caribbean, from Southern regions, not just from the Seminole Nation, but in nations in regards to Crow, Shawnee, Choctaw, Delaware, people, of course, in the North, but all these different groups have come together in many spaces because of diaspora, and they're living in Prince George's County today. And they've intermingled with people who are of Algonquin descent. And they literally have shared history, but that history is not discussed because people aren't thinking in terms of travel and distance as a means of molding things together.
Could I just mention something right here? It might seem a bit of a stretch, but in terms of, it's still in Black History Month, I'm going to go to Black Wall Street, specifically Tulsa in the Greenwood District. Yeah. Look at that. Look at what Tulsa was originally. Now, again, I talked about the establishment of Oklahoma. Tulsa was originally part of the Creek Nations, and many Creeks look like some of us here on the screen today. So it's interesting. I would say it's a highly educated guess that after statehood and as part of that horror that happened to those ancestors there, some of those ancestors are probably of Creek and African descent. But yeah, again, this is just the tip of the iceberg and one of many, many stories we can talk about.
Unfortunately, we only have so much time to talk about those stories. So again, just thank you so much again for everything you've shared. We're going to move into some question and answer time. If you have any questions, of course, it was mentioned in the chat, please put them in the chat and we will do the best we can answering these questions until our concluding time at 12:45. So first question I see, beyond the social cultural issue of identity, can you comment on how Afro-Native heritage affects or complicates the political issue of reparations for Black and Native peoples? Because it's critical for our nation to take up reparations. Lonnie, do you have any thoughts, Mr. Harrington?
I have the same question. This gets complicated. You know, some of our indigenous sisters and brothers were enslaved along with us. And we start talking about reparations of people of African descent. Are we including those as well coming from, let's say, indigenous communities as well? To be quite honest, I have my own particular way I would go about this. How the politicians deal with this, I think, is where the real problem lies. I think reparations should be made fully to anyone of African descent, because certainly many of us have, some of our ancestors were enslaved. Things are still happening among our indigenous communities, quote unquote, recognized, and we can't have time to go into that today, recognized community. Their struggles are ongoing in the face of social issues they have to deal with today, which have the roots going back centuries. So this is a very complicated question. I don't have a specific answer, but as somebody once said, the struggle continues. Thank you for that, by the way. It's a very crucial question.
I know one thing that has also come up from what I understand is that there are struggles happening today. I think it 2018, 17, around that time, maybe earlier. People who, for example, in Oklahoma were Cherokee freedmen, they were pushed off the rolls.
Gabriel, we have to, I don't know if you want to ever have me back. I'm often kicked out of places when I lecture. We can do a whole topic on Oklahoma.
Yeah. Same with Virginia too. Same with Virginia, with people who were Virginia natives and what happened with many of them getting an apology decades later because they had to denounce and reject others who were biracial because they couldn't keep land unless they said that they didn't identify as Black. These things have been discussed in many spaces. One prominent book is Let the Black Blood Remain Pure, which delves into some of this history extensively, and as mentioned before.
Well, let me go into something really quickly, how evil this is. In my own research, I came across court documents from Hyde County, North Carolina in 1843, where indigenous men, very quote unquote native looking men, were brought up on criminal charges for marrying Black women. in part of the court records, it said this is against the peace and dignity of the state. So yeah, this evil has takes many, many different manifestations.
By the way, with that being said, another question that came up. I was told by my parents and grandparents that I have Native American roots in Southern Prince George's County. I completed an ancestry test, which came back 0% Native American. Genealogists told me that this could be because the genetic pool was low. Is that
Gabriel, I can't hear you. Your volume went down.
I told my parents, you can hear me now?
No, you're still very faint.
I was told by my parents and grandparents that I have Native American roots in Southern Prince George's County. You can hear?
You're still faint, but I'm listening.
I completed an ancestry test, which came back 0% Native American. A genealogist told me that this could be because the genetic pool was low. Is this accurate? What are your thoughts, Lonnie?
Well, I was part of a panel in California in 2010. And when this was brought up, a professor in the audience during the question and answer session said that, you know, many of the genealogical results can be interpreted in 3 different ways. So that's one possible explanation. But going back specifically to this example, we have to take into account many times there are adoption protocols among the different nations. So somebody culturally may have been from that nation, but may not necessarily have the blood per se. I mean, again, you can do a whole different program on adoption protocols in different nations themselves. But that'd be one possible explanation for this particular person.
That is also something that I want to bring up because I have seen that discussed in many spaces with adoption itself, where they were adopted into tribes because many of the tribes worked alongside people of African descent to protect them when they were fleeing from enslavement. And that history of shared connection is left out in many spaces. So it's really critical for people to understand that in discussing what it means to be indigenous is not simply about ethnic roots, which leads to many other problems like blood quantum, saying you're only a Native American if you have this much blood in you, rather than seeing what your cultural heritage is like. And in many cases, again, with color being the basis as opposed to culture and your roots, it makes a huge difference. Am I making sense of what I'm saying?
Very much. And let's say this blood quantum is a very explosive issue in indigenous communities, to say the least. And again, I know I'm sounding redundant. We could have a whole program on that in itself.
I see another question. Everyone can hear me, of course.
You still faint. I don't know, maybe something on my end, but I didn't touch anything.
My organization is planning our 1-year anniversary with Creative Suitland. Will this recording be emailed to participants? My understanding is that this recording will be available if you are interested. And again, we have plenty of resources for people if they want to check out further information. We've only been able to tackle so much in our time. But again, this is just a brief overview, I apologize, by the way, for my volume being off earlier. Technical difficulties arise. But what I, again, would encourage everyone today is to consider your story and how your story matters. Blackness is not a monolithic experience. Blackness during Black History Month has to be seen for the beauty and the grandeur that it entails. And that means diversity, mass variety of experiences. And Afro-Indigenous experiences are a part of that conversation. Oh man, I have so many books I want to reference right now. Lonnie, Mr. Harrington.
Can I be cultural geeky here and give
of course, the cultural. Mr. Harrington, of course, Mr. Harrington.
Okay, at the risk of being, well, let me put it aside. I might be preaching to the converted, but I'm gonna give you a homework assignment for everyone. Research the Battle of the Negro Fort. Okay, if you want to talk about cultural intersections, certainly get into Seminole history, but look into that. That'll give you much to think about. It's directly relevant to what we now call Seminole history, but again, in terms of the broader picture of African and Indigenous intersections, I think that's a good place to start if you're just beginning this journey.
And we actually have our time is coming quickly to a close. Do we have any other questions? Any other questions, please? In the time we have till 12:45, you're welcome to throw your questions out. Please do. I see a question from Miss Dolly Turner. Who is the author?
I wasn't referring to a specific author in terms of the Negro Fort. There's much information available from many different sources. So if you look at that topic, Battle of the Negro Fort, you can have many different sources you could tap upon.
Also, I would recommend this book for anyone that can see, Maroon Societies, Black Slave Communities in the Americas. Maroon Societies, Black Slave Communities in the Americas. This is one book among many, but it talks specifically about this dynamic of how people of African descent came to the Americas, and not only did they join with indigenous peoples, but in many cases they created something completely new. So for those part of the African diaspora, part of us celebrating includes celebrating our unique and beautiful histories. Please, if you need resources, do your research and consider what your ancestors have to say. Talk to your elders. This is one thing we want to drive home during Black History Month. I heard a quote and I love it. When an elder dies, you lose an entire library. This is why this presentation matters, because so many people have lost elders and never took time to ask their elders in their words what they think. And may I just go ahead and say that when it comes to recording history, there's something wrong when people who are not part of our history are telling us how to see ourselves. And oral stories are a part of historical stories. Oral storytelling, that is a matter of historical documentation. When people say, well, it's not really valid because it's orally transmitted, we don't have things written in stone. Many indigenous cultures did not write everything about themselves in stone. Am I correct about that, Mr. Harrington?
True.
Okay. So consider the oral stories of your ancestors, and also consider why many of them chose to identify. One thing, this is a story from the South that I experienced. I met people who were part of the Yamasee peoples and Catawba and several others. And you know, it was interesting. At one point, there were many who chose to identify as African American. Why was that? Because there was open season on Native Americans. The whole term Redskins is offensive to Native Americans. It's because people at one point were labeled red due to their skin color. Cinnamon peoples were one people from historical America who were indigenous. And people were literally paid money to scalp and defame Native Americans.
And much worse, by the way. We won't get into the atrocities, but yeah, bounties were placed on indigenous bodies.
Right. I was shocked.
A familiar theme here in terms of being under the influence of melanin and oppression, but again, that could be a whole other topic we explore at some point in time.
And I wish we had time for it, but we will in the future, God willing. But that's a huge point. When you see people that said our ancestors identified as African American, not because we were ashamed of our roots or ashamed of being African American, we already had cultural intersection, but you had a higher chance of surviving as a person of African American background because at least we could handle slavery. But you were being killed if you were on that native land. And those stories are very common. So it's critical to understand with identification that it's not just about your genetics. By the way, if you check out spaces like 23andMe, they talk about some of these dynamics when it comes to talking about your ancestors and elders. So please consider this conversation. We can only go so far. And we're coming up to the close of our program. I just want to mention briefly, if I may say, if you have appreciated this program today, please let us know your thoughts. Go to the Prince George's African American Museum and Cultural Center to see some of the virtual programs that we've been doing for the last year or so, and keep the conversation going. If you have resources you want to share with us, please, by all means, share, because we're in this conversation together. Mr. Harrington, with that being said, again, I just thank you so much for sharing today and being a part of this amazing presentation and sharing your time. And again, if you're interested in this program and what we have to offer, please donate. Visit the www.pgaamcc.org to make a donation today. We appreciate all of what you guys are doing in your respective spheres of influence.
I will say one of my languages, the Ilapanki Miccosukee language, Shanabesha Amashamala. Thank you, my friends.
We appreciate everyone here today. You guys have a wonderful day. On behalf of the Prince George's African American Museum and Cultural Center, be proud of all of who we are. This raised.